Thank you so much, Jim. I was going to talk a little bit about my identity because today I want to talk a little bit about different perspectives and different realities. And I thought it could be useful to start by mentioning the fact that I am mentioned as Overseas Development Institute, and I do work with Overseas Development Institute, but now I'm also coming to work here. And I also have an affiliation with the Stockholm Environment Institute. So that is sort of a multiple identity. I'm just going to jump right into it. I wanted to start by talking about these people. These are people in Torres Islands in Vanuatu in the South Pacific. And here in this photo, you can see them protesting coastal erosion because coastal erosion is threatening their homes. But this is actually the story of the loss of traditional knowledge and beliefs. Because these people's ancestors built their villages on coral platforms that were 100 meters up and away from the sea, because they knew that there was a risk if you lived too close to the coast, especially tsunamis and coastal sea surges. But the people who live in Torres Islands now have been described as some of the most vulnerable to climate change, especially sea level rise. Because they're living at the coast. So what happened to this ancestral wisdom that taught that it was safer to live away from the coast, and why did people move down from their platforms? The answer lies in the black magic that the ancestors believed was actually causing the hazards. And, probably not surprisingly, the migration down to the coast occurred as the islands were being converted to Christianity, because that resulted in the rejection of black magic, and with it, the rejection of this idea that black magic had any responsibility for the hazards. So now the risk posed by tsunamis and coastal hazards was no longer feared. It was no longer an issue. So today I want to present some of the examples of how culture interacts with risk. And I want to focus on these questions, although I realize I have a lot of questions that I'm raising throughout the presentation. But I think ultimately these are the three questions that I'd like to come back to. First, what conditions facilitate a shift in worldviews to incorporate risk reduction? And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about that, or what I mean with that. And then, whose understanding of risk is correct? And if perceptions of reality are culturally defined, does this mean that there is such a thing as alternative facts? Many of us who work on climate change and disaster risk in the context of development are often confronted with the confounding fact that people tend to, or they choose to live in or return to or even relocate to places that get hit time and again by extreme weather events. But of course there are social, there are economic and political reasons for this. But there's also something else. Not everyone thinks that, looks at risk in the same way. So it could be that this sort of risk is part of living where they live. This is part of life. The risk posed by natural hazards might also be minuscule compared to the risks, or compared to the gain of being in a location where they can produce food and where they have a livelihood, they have income. And the bigger risk is actually loss of livelihood or starvation. Another explanation is that hazards are positive because they're proof of spirits or gods. And another explanation is that suffering is a pathway to a better life. So culture plays a critical role in the way that we think about risk and also how we engage with it. And there are two dimensions of culture and risk that I want to talk about today. So the first is that culture, in the form of practices and beliefs, plays a role in determining vulnerability to natural hazards. Beliefs can make people think or do things that actually make them more likely to be affected by hazards. And second is that culture serves as a barrier for carrying out certain measures that could reduce risk. So people may not take a threat seriously because their beliefs lead them to consider the risk not to be a risk. Or they may actually be prohibited from taking action because there would be cultural taboos. So if they want to reduce their exposure and sensitivity, they're actually breaking taboos, and therefore they can't do those things. So having spent many years extremely fascinated by this topic, it's become clear to me that this culture and risk is an inherently understudied topic in the context of disaster risk reduction. Sorry, I should put disaster risk reduction, DRR, and climate change, although I will say that it is gaining recognition. But it's not just another driver of vulnerability. I think it's so complex. And as I'll talk about later, just because someone subscribes to a certain belief system doesn't actually mean that they'll actually behave in a way that is consistent with the belief system or according to the doctrine when push comes to shove. And I also think that the study of this topic requires us to understand many dimensions. So it's not just culture, but we also have to understand how disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation practice works, and how these may or may not be consistent or be inconsistent with the role played by culture. So here comes my outline. I want to talk about my background. How did I get into this topic? Then get into a few more examples from around the world, and then some points that have emerged for me that I think are sort of important, and then again, bigger questions that I have on the topic. So how did I get here? I actually started working when I did my fieldwork for my PhD, and I was in El Salvador, and I'll talk a little bit specifically about El Salvador. But it became clear to me that culture, in my case, particularly religion, was something that I needed to think about when I was working on adaptation, disaster risk reduction. And then during my postdoc, I did fieldwork in Ethiopia, and again, it became clear to me that this is an important topic, again, religion. And at that time, my question was, can religion be integrated into disaster risk reduction and adaptation so that people's beliefs can still be given space? And to some extent, I still have that question, but it's matured a bit, luckily. And I was lucky enough to get together with 3 other scholars who were really interested in culture and risk, primarily from the disaster risk reduction community, who together we were able to get some funding to do a conference on culture and risk, or culture and disasters to be accurate, in Bielefeld in 2011, and then there was a follow-up conference in 2013, and that led to the edited book Cultures and Disasters that has some really good contributions. That was published by Routledge. And then also we were invited by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to edit their flagship annual report, which is called World Disasters Report, and focus on culture and risk, which is also a satisfying experience, I think, because it showed that this topic was something that even the Red Cross recognized that they really needed to address and understand as well. And earlier this year in January, I was invited to give a TEDx in Ho Chi Minh City, which is where I live. And I was also going to mention that hopefully I'm not going to cough, but I do have a bad cough, and I do think that it comes from the pollution in Ho Chi Minh City. But the TEDx topic was supposed to be something on environment, and I thought that it would be interesting to talk about culture instead, because I think that is something that everybody can relate to, and because these were people from just off the street, it needs to be something that people could relate to easily in their lives. So that's essentially how I got here. And now I think I need to sort of define culture, because what I'm talking about, and as you probably know if you've studied anthropology or if you have come across culture, I mean, there's quite contested ways of defining, there are many ways of defining culture, but what I'm talking about essentially are things like religion, folklore, customs, traditions, art, knowledge, as well as material possessions that get handed over from generation to generation, and that essentially contribute to defining groups or individuals. And culture shapes the way that we think about the world. It's the way that we interpret what's happening around us, and the way that we justify or explain challenges and dangers when we don't understand them. So by way of example, I'm going to talk about the story of Sun Ting and Tui Ting, which is a very common story in Vietnam. Everybody from the woman who cleans my house to the Uber drivers seem to have heard of this story. Sun Ting is the spirit of the mountains, and Tui Ting is the spirit of the seas, or the waters. And the story goes like this. Sun Ting and Tui Ting both sought to marry the same beautiful princess. And they began a fight, which made the waters stormy, as you can see from the photo. Sorry, it's not a photo, but picture. But Sun Ting successfully averted the storm by lifting the mountains higher. And in his frustration with defeat, Tui Ting, the water spirit, tries again each year to flood the lands, and this apparently explains the annual monsoons in Vietnam. and possibly also the typhoon that's currently battering the central coast of Vietnam. So this story demonstrates how people look for explanations. We don't like uncertainty and unknowns. In Norse mythology, for example, you probably know this, we explain thunder and lightning through Tobr, or Thor, who is riding around in his chariot with his goats, and that explains the thunder, and he throws his hammer around, and that is what explains the lightning. And this is actually how I explain to my daughter what's going on. And of course, living in Vietnam, we have lots of lightning and thunder, so she knows that Tobr is going around in the sky. But the outcome is that culture plays an important role in defining the way that we think about and react to climate change and natural hazards as well. So both the impacts themselves and the threats of those impacts taking place. Hazards have been, and this is probably something you've come across, hazards have been considered acts of gods or spirits or their adversaries for centuries, under the pretext that nature was created and controlled by divine or mystical agents. So humans have little or no influence, as the events are basically beyond human control. And around the world, there remains a continued belief in this divine explanation of disasters. But that doesn't always mean that people don't take action. However, one thing that is quite interesting to note is that governments can take advantage of this, and they sometimes even encourage this belief, because it's a way to take focus away from their failures in spatial planning, corruption in infrastructure construction, and other mistakes that they're actually making their citizens more vulnerable to natural hazards. So moving to El Salvador, to the Bajo Lempa, which is in the eastern part of El Salvador, which is where I did my PhD fieldwork, but it's a long time ago now. What I found really interesting in El Salvador was I actually didn't realize from the beginning that I was going into that I was going to find out that there was this big distinction between two different religions. So the history is really interesting in El Salvador. During the Civil War in the 1980s, the Catholic Church was a strong supporter of the rebel communities. The Catholic Church influenced by liberation theology. And if you don't know what that is, I highly recommend looking it up. It's very interesting, and it definitely helps understand sort of the way that people fought through very grim circumstances. But the US government, of course, didn't like this, and so they helped fund missionaries who were evangelical Protestants. And they were essentially hoping that this new church would undermine the Catholic Church. And the key characteristics of evangelical Protestantism that attracted the US were fatalism and individualism, both of which discouraged taking actions to change one's social conditions. So this was, of course, appealing to many of the people who felt that they're hopeless and they had nothing they could do in the face of the bloody war that had been going on for years. But it's interesting because, and also because this religion suggests that it's better just to do nothing and wait for the next life, which will be better. But it also attracts a lot of people who feel helpless in the face of hurricanes. And so when I went to do fieldwork in El Salvador, I was asking questions about, what are you doing to reduce the impact of hurricanes, and particularly Hurricane Mitch, which had taken place in 1998 and was a really big hurricane. And I was there in 2002. And there were two types of responses. Some people were saying, okay, well, we're trying to do this, and we're trying to take some action to prevent the river from flooding. But there were others who were saying that there's nothing to do because such an extreme event is sent by God to test us. And if we suffer now, we'll be better off in our afterlives. So interestingly, both groups actually claimed that God was responsible. Most everybody said that God was the one who was sending. But they had two totally different attitudes about what to do. And this I later learned when I started to ask questions. Why is it the case that there's such different perspectives on this? This is actually the consequence of belonging to these two different religious groups. So this meant that those who were Catholic were more proactive and felt empowered by their beliefs. and those who were Protestant were more fatalistic and essentially disempowered by their beliefs. But I think it's important to note that not all of these examples come from sort of exotic developing countries. There's also a very interesting example from Switzerland. Since 1678, there are villagers in the canton of Valais in the Swiss Alps have been praying for the retreat of this glacier, the Great Aletsch Glacier. It was constantly causing floods and avalanches, and so they were hoping that it would just disappear and go away. But with the changing climate, the glacier started to retreat really rapidly, and they suddenly realized that actually this was not a good thing. They noticed that this was reducing the availability of drinking water, of food for livestock, and energy. So they became worried that their prayers had been working too well. As you can see, this is from a National Geographic article. So I captured this. So in 2009, their bishop petitioned the Vatican to authorize a change in the annual processional liturgy so that the villagers could ask God to stop the ice from shrinking instead. And the Holy See apparently took an entire year to decide, but they finally agreed that this was allowed. The next example comes from a project that I worked on with the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, which is based in Kathmandu. And this was a project looking at coping strategies across the Hindu Kush Himalayas. And we found some interesting cultural dimensions, of course. So on the right, well, on your left, sorry, I'm dyslexic, so you see the houses. These are houses that are constructed by the Mishing community. Mishing are a tribal group, and they're considered to be quite sort of low on the scale, and they've developed this adaptation over the course of many years because they live in a place that constantly floods, and so they build their houses on stilts. But there are other ethnic groups living in the area as well. This is in Assam. And they don't build their houses on stilts, even though they would like to, because they do not want to be associated with the Mishings, and they don't want to be confused for the Mishings. So they acknowledge that actually it would be a good idea to build the houses on stilts. But what they do instead is they put their houses on a higher plinth, and then they raise their beds inside their houses. So this is a non-Mishing house. And in the project, it was interesting because we came across this, but then it became really obvious because there was a team in the project that was sent out to do a film to document these coping strategies. The project was actually about adaptation strategies, but I really think this is coping strategies. And they interviewed people, and they interviewed non-Mishings who said, yes, we wish we could also build our houses on stilts because the Mishings don't lose as many things as we do every year when it floods. And then later there was an event to show the film to all the people who had been involved and who had been interviewed. And it became quite controversial because actually those people who had been interviewed demanded that that section of the film be removed where they were talking about how they would like to be like the Mishings, because they simply did not want to be confused with the Mishings. And so they're on the verge of breaking the taboos, on the verge of constructing their houses on stilts, but they just still wanted it to be kept quiet. I find the final example that I want to talk about is one that came up when I was just looking through the news, and this is a story that was captured by Reuters, and this is from December 2016. It was a story describing how a severe drought in Zimbabwe has led many people to consider the need for rainmaking ceremonies. And I thought the article was interesting because it notes that as rainmaking makes a comeback in parts of Zimbabwe, scientists warn that such traditions may prove a distraction for more effective ways to deal with drought. And the story continues that essentially the custom of rainmaking ceremonies would make people less inclined to switch from thirsty maize to something like sorghum or millet that doesn't need as much water. And for me, what this shows is that there are many people who simply don't know what to make of culture and these types of practices. It seems to be that they think this is a barrier for effective risk reduction. But actually there's a really interesting story from Kenya that also talks about people coming together after a prolonged drought to do rainmaking ceremonies. And that story was that the process of coming together was building social capital that was necessary to help people cope during the drought. So it's actually a positive thing. So what I've shown you, I hope, in the examples is that beliefs can be really powerful in influencing how people understand and interact with risk. And they definitely influence how people think about the way the world works. But there are some disadvantages. Because beliefs which are intertwined with habits and traditions can be an obstacle for building back differently, for relocating people or making other changes to livelihoods, which to help reduce exposure sensitivity to natural hazards. I think this is shown in El Salvador. Also, beliefs contribute to creating the vulnerability that can convert hazards into disasters because they can encourage attitudes or behavior that expose people and make them more sensitive to hazards, like in the Torres Islands. And also beliefs can create an alternative reality that makes it difficult to educate about risk reduction. And I think that was also the case in the Torres Islands. But I think it's necessary to point out that there are also positive dimensions of beliefs. Beliefs help people cope with both immediate impacts as well as longer-term consequences of a disaster because they're an important psychological and social element of recovery. And beliefs also offer social networks, and these also help with recovery. They provide support, they provide information, and sometimes financial resources. I think that this, the example that I mentioned quickly from Kenya essentially demonstrates this. And they can also offer a platform or a framework or a sort of social grouping that can be useful for educating about risk reduction, such as in the Swiss Alps. So this leads me to some key questions that I want to explore further. And I've already mentioned a little bit these, but first of all, what conditions would facilitate a shift in worldview to incorporate risk reduction? Oh, sorry, I should say risk reduction. Can we integrate beliefs into mainstream work on disaster risk reduction and adaptation to climate change, or is this too controversial, and will it touch on too many taboo issues? The purpose of this work is not to criticize beliefs or religion in any way, but I think it's easy to see how it might be interpreted this way, because often the examples from the field that are brought out, to some extent, describe beliefs as harmful. When I've talked about religion as a driver of social vulnerability, and especially to sort of explain how complex social vulnerability is, I've come across many occasions where afterwards people have come up to me and they've told me, very bad topic, do not talk about this. And I think that's because people feel personally attacked. Think that I'm attacking their religious beliefs, and it could also have to do with the way I presented it, but I think it is a very sort of difficult topic. So I'm also interested in understanding how people justify shifts or parallel belief systems. I didn't talk about this very much, but there are places around the world where people have multiple belief systems, and they can draw on the beliefs that they think are appropriate for a given situation. So I'd like to understand how people justify these choices, because sometimes there are actually contradictions between belief systems, and so I'd like to know how that works. And then I'm interested in understanding how we can actually enable the conditions that facilitate cultural shifts, or can we facilitate them? First of all, and what would be necessary to do that? I also think it's important to understand, if possible, the relative importance of belief systems in vulnerability to climate change or natural hazards. Because I think you can ask, how important is belief really? Can we measure it? Can beliefs be a predictor of behavior? And this is very important. And if you talk to psychologists, they'll probably say that you don't, just because somebody believes something doesn't mean they behave that way. The reality is that people might say one thing because they want to conform to social pressures around them, and therefore they say that they believe something. But when a huge flood is heading their way, do they actually stay in their house and hope that God will protect them, or do they just put fate into their own hands and run for the hills. Also, will two people behave the same way, or two people of the same belief behave the same way in the face of a hazard? So here I want to step back, because you probably noticed that all of these questions essentially come from my perspective that risk needs to be reduced. And this to some extent contradicts some of the points that I've been making, which are that there are different ways of understanding risk and that we need to respect all perspectives. But I think you can't be neutral when you talk about this topic. Just saying that we want to reduce risk, obviously, I'm looking through my set of glasses with my worldview and my understanding of what risk is. But at the same time, problems are likely to arise if those people who are designing and implementing activities to address risk don't recognize the challenging and important role that's played by culture. So even if we consider that people's beliefs are irrational or a barrier for reducing risk, we just can't wish them to go away. We actually have to work with them. So acknowledging that they're there is really crucial. So now I want to talk about alternative facts. And you might have figured out at this point why I put this in the title. Of course, I found this concept really frustrating, as probably everybody, but I think it does somehow relate to what I've been talking about, in the sense that the alternative facts suggest that there are different truths. There are some truths that we may not quite understand that happen in the politics of the United States, but it is somehow consistent with thinking about ontology and science and technology studies. The idea that there are many ways of knowing the truth. And from this perspective, it's not that easy to flatly refute this concept of alternative facts. So I'm obviously no proponent of using this term or this phrase because it's so political, but I think the examples that I've given today offer an argument for why everyone does have their own way of seeing the world and understanding what goes on around us. But the question is, of course, if there are multiple realities, whose reality counts? And is a world in which black magic operates an alternative reality? And if so, alternative to what? This reaches into questions of power, of equity, of elites, of cultural hegemony, and thus loops back to many of the factors that are actually driving vulnerability to climate change and natural hazards, and also poverty. So another question is, how can we work with people's risk perceptions and practices without suggesting that one version of reality is superior to another, even when some beliefs are potentially or actually a barrier to reducing risk? So ontology in science and technology studies is not at all my core field, and if you start asking me about this, I'm not going to be able to tell you much, but I'm raising this as a potential avenue for exploring the ideas that I presented today. I also think that we can get into a discussion about the co-production of knowledge, which is quite trendy at the moment. It seems to be all over the place. In particular, the extent to which we, and I say we as sort of scientists, are willing to let culture influence our scientific understanding of climate change and disaster risk. And I think this is particularly relevant to a school and an institute that, by nature of the topic it's addressing, has to carry out interdisciplinary work. So you're more than welcome to drop me a line if you want to talk more about this, and I can share some publications, share some more resources, and that's my email address. So thank you very much.